all triggered by one desperate single mother's $500 last chance. Gamble to escape eviction and secure her son's future in the most unlikely place she could have ever imagined. Before we dive into this incredible journey, drop a comment and let us know where you're watching from. And if this story moves you, make sure to hit that subscribe button because tomorrow I've got something absolutely mind-blowing saved just for you. The October wind cut through the broken windows of the abandoned cabin as Maria Santos stepped out of her battered 2010 Honda Pilot. Her hands trembling not from the Montana cold, but from the magnitude of what she was about to discover beneath. The rotting floorboards of what appeared to be just another failed real estate investment? At 29, Maria had never imagined herself standing in the middle of nowhere, clutching the deed to a property she'd bought, sight unseen, for exactly $500. The last money in her checking account after 3 months of unemployment, and a stack of overdue bills that seemed to grow taller each day. Her former life as a construction project manager in Billings felt like a distant memory now, replaced by the desperate reality of eviction notices, late-night job applications, and the weight of being a single mother trying to provide for her 8-year-old son Diego, the journey that had brought her to this remote corner of Glacier County began with a phone call that had shattered everything she thought she knew about financial security. It was a Tuesday morning in July when her supervisor at Mountain West Construction called to inform her that the company had lost its 3 largest contracts due to economic downturn. And as one of the newer project managers, she was being laid off effective immediately. The severance package had seemed generous at first 2 months' salary and health insurance coverage through September. But the construction industry in Montana had been devastated by supply chain issues and inflation, leaving dozens of qualified project managers competing for a handful of positions. Despite her excellent track record, managing commercial builds, and her certification in sustainable construction practices, weeks turned into months without even a callback. Maria's comfortable 2-bedroom apartment in Billings Heights became increasingly difficult to maintain. The $1,200 monthly rent that had been manageable on her $65,000 annual salary became impossible on unemployment benefits of $425 per week. She'd started selling possessions, first her exercise equipment, then Diego's old toys, finally her power tools and construction equipment that represented years of professional investment. The breaking point came on a rainy September evening, when Diego, doing homework at their kitchen table, looked up and asked, "Mom, why do you cry when you look at the mail?" She'd been trying so hard to shield him from their financial crisis, maintaining routines of school pickup, homework help, and bedtime stories while privately calculating how many more weeks they could survive on ramen noodles and generic peanut butter. That night, after Diego fell asleep, Maria sat on her couch, surrounded by past due notices and mortgage statements that might as well have been written in a foreign language for all the hope they offered. Her laptop was balanced precariously on a stack of unpaid bills as she scrolled through job listings she'd already applied to 3 times, real estate websites featuring apartments she couldn't afford, and finally, in a moment of desperation, government auction sites. She'd heard other construction workers mention buying foreclosed properties at tax auctions, fixing them up and either flipping them or using them as rental income. With her project management background and hands-on construction experience, the concept made theoretical sense. But she'd never seriously considered it because she'd never been desperate enough to risk her limited resources on something so uncertain. That's when she discovered the world of online property auctions, where counties across the United States sold tax-delinquent properties to recover unpaid taxes. Most required substantial down payments and attracted serious investors with deep pockets, but buried in the listings were occasional properties so remote, so damaged, or so legally complicated that they attracted minimal interest. At 2:17 a.m. on a Thursday night in early October, while Diego slept on the couch because their electricity had been turned off earlier that day for non-payment, Maria found herself scrolling through page 12 of Glacier County, Montana's tax foreclosure listings. Most properties were selling for thousands of dollars, amounts that might as well have been millions given her financial situation. Then she saw it, listing number 847, historic mining cabin, circa 1903, 2.7 acres, Whitefish Mountain region. Remote access, no utilities. Structural issues noted. Historical significance related to early 20th century mining operations. Starting bid $500, no reserve. The thumbnail photo showed what charitable real estate agents might call a fixer-upper opportunity. Honest ones would label a teardown waiting to happen. Weather-beaten logs formed walls that seemed to sag under the weight of nearly 120 years. The roof had more holes than shingles, and windows that had clearly surrendered their glass to decades of harsh mountain winters created dark, empty sockets that gave the structure an almost haunted appearance. But Maria's trained eye saw something else. Beneath the obvious deterioration, the cabin's foundation looked remarkably solid poured concrete that appeared to have been professionally installed. Unusual for a structure built in 1903. The log construction, though weathered to a silver-gray patina, showed the kind of craftsmanship that suggested it had been built not just to shelter, but to endure. The logs were massive. Probably 12-inch diameter pines that would have required significant effort to harvest, transport, and position. More intriguingly, the property description mentioned historical significance related to early 20th century mining operations. Maria's curiosity was piqued. Having managed several historical renovation projects, she knew that properties with genuine historical significance often qualified for grants, tax credits, and other financial incentives that could make restoration financially viable. She spent the next 3 days at the Billings Public Library using their free internet access to research everything she could find about the property and its history. What she discovered was a fascinating puzzle filled with tantalizing gaps and mysterious circumstances that seemed to suggest the property held secrets beyond its obvious challenges. The cabin had been built in 1903 by one Jeremiah Whitmore, silver prospector who had arrived in Montana during the late 1890s mining boom. Unlike many prospectors who chased rumors and hunches, Whitmore appeared to have been methodical and successful. County records showed that he'd operated the nearby Silverbrook mine continuously for nearly 2 decades, extracting enough silver to maintain the property, support himself, and even expand his operations. But in 1924, right when U.S. Geological Survey reports suggested the area might contain significant untapped gold deposits, Whitmore had suddenly abandoned the property and vanished without a trace. Not just disappeared, vanished, and no forwarding. Addressed no communication with local businesses where he'd maintained accounts. No contact with the few neighbors who lived within reasonable traveling distance. Even stranger, according to county records, the cabin had been transferred that same year to one Augustus Brennan, described in documents as a former mining engineer with connections to the U.S. Geological Survey and extensive experience in geological assessment of mineral-bearing properties. The transfer appeared to have been legitimate, with proper documentation and even what looked like a substantial payment, recorded in bank records Maria managed to access through historical society archives. But Augustus Brennan, mysteriously, had died just 6 months after acquiring the property. The death certificate, which Maria found in digitized county records, listed the cause as mining accident, structural collapse, and underground excavation. The location was given simply as Silverbrook mine property, with no additional details about circumstances, witnesses, or recovery of remains. What made Brennan's death even more puzzling was that, according to his background, he was an experienced mining engineer who had worked on major operations across the western United States. Such professionals were trained to recognize and avoid the kinds of structural hazards that supposedly killed him. And why would an experienced engineer be working alone in a mine that had been abandoned by its previous owner? After Brennan's death, the property had remained tied up in legal complications for nearly a century. Maria found records of multiple attempts to purchase or develop the land, but every effort had been blocked by complex title issues, environmental concerns, or bureaucratic obstacles that seemed to appear whenever someone got close to finalizing a deal. Mining companies had expressed interest in the 1940s, 1960s, and as recently as the 1990s. But their applications for development permits had been consistently denied for reasons that ranged from environmental protection 2. Historical preservation. 2. Ongoing federal geological survey requirements. Land developers had made offers to purchase the property for recreational or residential development, but their proposals had been rejected due to access limitations and infrastructure requirements that exceed county development standards. Even individual buyers had tried to acquire the property through normal real estate channels, but their attempts had been frustrated by title complications that seemed to regenerate whenever they were supposedly resolved. It was as if the property was protected by some invisible barrier that prevented ownership transfer under normal circumstances, until Maria's desperate $500 bid, submitted online at 11:47 p.m. on October 10th, while Diego slept on the couch because their electricity had been turned off earlier that day for non-payment. This became the first successful offer to clear all legal hurdles in 99 years. The county clerk who processed her bid had seemed genuinely surprised when the transaction went through without complications. "Ma'am," he'd said during their brief phone conversation, "I've been working here for 23 years, and I've never seen this property actually sell. Usually something comes up: title issues, environmental concerns, federal restrictions. Are you sure you understand what you're purchasing?" Maria had assured him she understood she was buying a remote, damaged property with no utilities, difficult access, and significant restoration challenges. What she didn't mention was that she understood something else. This property represented her last a chance to create stability for herself and Diego before they became homeless. Now, standing in the mountain silence with her failing SUV ticking as it cooled and 2 duffel bags containing everything she and Diego owned, Maria was beginning to understand that her impulsive purchase might be either the smartest decision she'd ever made, or the final mistake that would leave them both stranded in the Montana wilderness. The isolation was immediately apparent. According to her GPS, the nearest neighbor was over 8 miles away, accessible only by the same deteriorating Forest Service road she'd just traveled. Its closest town, Whitefish, was nearly 30 miles down the mountain and consisted of little more than a gas station, general store, and a handful of houses clustered around what had once been a thriving lumber and mining community. But there was something about this place that went beyond the obvious challenges and the isolation, something that was both terrifying and oddly hopeful. Maybe it was the way the afternoon sunlight caught the silver-gray patina of the aged logs, revealing the quality of craftsmanship that had allowed this structure to survive 120 years of harsh mountain weather. Maybe it was the spectacular view of snow-capped peaks that stretched endlessly toward the horizon, a vista that belonged on postcards and calendars rather than in the reality of her desperate financial situation. Or maybe it was simply the fact that after months of losing everything that mattered, her job, her savings, her sense of security, her confidence in her ability to provide for her son, she finally owned something again. Something solid and permanent that couldn't be taken away by corporate downsizing, inflation, or landlords who preferred tenants with steady incomes. As she approached the cabin, Maria noticed details that hadn't been visible in the auction photos. The structure was larger than she'd expected. It's probably 1,200 square feet spread across what appeared to be a main floor and a partial loft area. The logs were massive, probably 14-inch diameter pines that would have required significant effort and expertise to harvest, transport, and position. This wasn't the quick construction of a temporary mining camp. This was a building designed to be someone's permanent home. The heavy wooden door was reinforced with iron bands and hardware that looked original to the 1903 construction. Despite being exposed to more than a century of weather, the wood appeared intact, protected somewhat by a small overhang that had shielded it from the worst of the mountain storms. Carved into the timber beside the entrance, barely visible beneath decades of weathering, were words that made Maria's breath catch: Silverbrook. Mining claim, ESD. 1903, fortune favors the bold. The inscription sent a chill through her that had nothing to do with the mountain air. Those words seemed to speak directly to her current situation, a desperate gamble based on limited information and unlimited hope. But there was something about the carving that suggested it had been meant as more than inspirational decoration. The letters were deep and precise, cut by someone who intended them to last. and the phrase itself seemed oddly prophetic given her circumstances. What Maria couldn't know as she turned the rusted door handle was that her $500 gamble had just activated a sequence of events that had been waiting nearly a century to unfold. Hidden beneath the cabin she'd just purchased lay secrets that Jeremiah Whitmore had died protecting and Augustus Brennan had given his life to preserve. Secrets that would either provide the fresh start Maria desperately needed for herself and Diego, or draw them into a dangerous game where the stakes were measured not in hundreds of dollars, but in millions. The door opened with surprising ease, revealing an interior that defied her expectations based on the exterior's deteriorated appearance. Instead of the rotting floorboards and collapsed ceilings she'd anticipated, Maria found herself looking at a space that, while dusty and obviously long abandoned, showed remarkable structural integrity. The floors were wide plank pine that appeared solid underfoot, and the walls showed the same quality craftsmanship evident in the exterior construction. More surprisingly, the interior showed signs of having been carefully prepared for long-term abandonment rather than hastily evacuated. Furniture was covered with canvas tarps that, while faded and dusty, had protected the pieces beneath from serious deterioration. Kitchen implements hung neatly on hooks, and shelves still held containers that might once have held flour, sugar, and other non-perishable supplies. It was as if someone had planned to be away temporarily rather than permanently, expecting to return to continue their work. But according to the records Maria had researched, no one had lived here since Augustus Brennan's death in 1924, nearly a century ago. As she explored the main room, Maria began to understand why this property had attracted interest from mining companies and land developers for decades. Despite its remote location and obvious restoration challenges, the cabin occupied a spectacular setting with clear views of the surrounding mountains and valley. During its operational years, this location would have provided perfect visibility of approaching visitors, changing weather conditions, and the activities at the Silverbrook mine, which she could see in the distance as a partially collapsed opening in the mountainside about a quarter mile from the cabin. But there was something else about the interior that captured her attentions, something that her construction background helped her recognize as unusual. The floor plan seemed larger than the exterior dimensions should have allowed, and there were subtle architectural details that suggested hidden spaces or storage areas that weren't immediately apparent. Maria made a mental note to conduct a more thorough exploration once she'd established basic safety and security measures. With Diego arriving tomorrow with her sister Carmen, who'd agreed to drive him from Billings, she needed to focus on making the cabin habitable rather than investigating its historical mysteries. But as the Montana sunset painted the mountains in shades of gold and amber that seemed almost prophetic, Maria allowed herself a moment of cautious optimism. Her desperate $500 gamble had given her ownership of a property that, despite its obvious challenges, had solid bones and spectacular potential. With her project management skills, construction background, and sheer determination to create stability for Diego, she might actually be able to transform this abandoned cabin into the fresh start they both needed. What she couldn't possibly imagine was that she was standing directly above one of the largest undiscovered gold deposits in North American history, or that her presence at this long-protected property had already attracted the attention of forces that had been waiting decades for exactly this opportunity. Maria's first night in the cabin was a testament to both her desperation and her determination. With no electricity, no running water, and temperatures dropping into the 30s, she'd managed to build a fire in the stone fireplace. Using matches from her emergency kit and kindling she'd gathered from the surrounding forest, the fireplace remarkably drew perfectly, another sign of the quality construction that had allowed this structure to survive 120 years of harsh mountain winters. By the flickering light of that fire, she'd unpacked her few belongings and taken inventory of her situation. 2 duffel bags of clothes, a backpack containing her laptop, important documents, and Diego's favorite books, a cooler with enough food for 2 days, basic camping supplies she'd borrowed from her sister Carmen, and exactly $47 in cash all that remained after the $500 property purchase and the gas money to drive from Billings. Her phone showed 2 bars of service. It's better than she'd expected for such a remote location, which meant she could at least maintain contact with Diego and potentially search for work opportunities online. The laptop battery was nearly dead, but she'd noticed what appeared to be a generator shed behind the cabin that might contain a portable power source. If she could get it working, but it was during those quiet hours by firelight, listening to the wind through the pines and the settling sounds of an old building, that Maria began to truly understand the magnitude of the gamble she'd taken. This wasn't just about buying an unusual property. She'd committed herself and her son to rebuilding their lives in one of the most remote locations in Montana, with no backup plan, no safety net, and resources that wouldn't last a week. A financial crisis that had brought her to this point had been building for longer than she'd wanted to admit, even to herself. Her job as a construction project manager at Mountain West Construction hadn't just been employment, it had been her identity, her source of pride, and her pathway to the middle-class stability she'd fought so hard to achieve as a single mother. Maria had started at Mountain West 5 years earlier as an assistant project coordinator, working her way up through competence, dedication, and a willingness to tackle the most challenging assignments. She'd managed the restoration of the historic Moss Mansion in Billings, coordinated the construction of 3 new elementary schools, and earned her project management professional certification while working full-time and raising Diego. Her colleagues respected her attention to detail, her ability to coordinate complex schedules involving multiple contractors, and her talent for solving problems that stumped more experienced managers. She'd been earning $65,000 annually, not wealthy by any measure, but enough to afford a comfortable apartment, reliable childcare, and the kind of stability that allowed her to plan for Diego's future rather than simply surviving day to day. The layoff had been completely unexpected. Mountain West had weathered previous economic downturns, and Maria's projects were consistently delivered on time and under budget. But when the company lost 3 major contracts in the same month, a hospital expansion canceled due to funding issues, commercial development postponed indefinitely, a municipal project rejected by voters, the financial impact was immediate and devastating. We're implementing immediate cost reduction measures. Her supervisor had explained during the brief meeting that ended her career. Fortunately, that means eliminating 6 project management positions. You're a valued employee, Maria, but with your shorter tenure, you're among those being let go. We'll provide 2 months severance and continue health insurance through September. The conversation had lasted less than 10 minutes. 5 years of professional growth, career development, and financial planning destroyed in the time it took to sign paperwork and clean out her desk. She'd driven home in a daze, trying to figure out how to explain to Diego that their lives were about to change dramatically. The first month had been manageable. The severance pay covered their expenses, and Maria was confident she'd find another position quickly. Her resume was strong, her references were excellent. Montana's construction industry had been growing steadily for years. She applied for positions with other general contractors, specialized project management firms, and even considered relocating to cities with more opportunities. But the same economic pressures that had forced Mountain West to lay off employees were affecting the entire industry. Construction projects were being canceled or delayed. Contractors were reducing staff rather than hiring, and the few available positions attracted dozens of qualified applicants. Maria found herself competing against project managers with decades more experience, advanced degrees, and connections she couldn't match. By the second month, she lowered her salary expectations and expanded her search to include positions that were technically beneath her qualifications: assistant project coordinator roles, construction administrative positions, even general office work that would utilize some of her organizational skills. But employers seemed to view her as either overqualified for lower-level positions or insufficiently experienced for senior roles. The unemployment benefits helped, but $425 per week was less than half her previous income. She'd started making difficult choices, generic groceries instead of brand names, canceling Diego's after-school activities, postponing routine car maintenance that her Honda desperately needed. Each month brought new calculations about which bills could be delayed and which services could be eliminated. The third month, had been when the real panic set in. The unemployment benefits continued, but her savings were gone. Her credit cards were approaching their limits, and her landlord was making increasingly pointed comments about rent that was consistently late. She'd swallowed her pride and applied for assistance programs, discovering the humiliating complexity of systems designed to help people in her situation while simultaneously making them feel ashamed for needing help. Food assistance required waiting in lines, filling out forms, providing documentation that seemed designed to discourage applicants. Temporary cash assistance involved even more bureaucracy and qualification requirements that excluded people who'd been responsible enough to have savings or who owned vehicles worth more than arbitrary limits. The social services system seemed built for people who'd never had stable middle-class lives, rather than those who'd lost that stability through circumstances beyond their control. Diego had been remarkably resilient throughout the crisis, but she'd seen the stress affecting him in subtle ways. He'd become quieter, more careful about asking for things he wanted, more eager to help with household tasks, as if he understood their financial situation better than she'd wanted him to. When his class had planned a field trip to Yellowstone that cost $85, he'd announced he didn't want to go, claiming he wasn't interested in seeing boring old geysers. The eviction notice had arrived on a Tuesday in September, taped to their door, when she returned from another fruitless job interview. 30 days to pay $3,600 in back rent or vacate the premises? The amount might as well have been $36,000 given her financial situation. Her landlord, who'd been understanding about late payments for months, had finally reached the limit of his patience. "I'm sorry, Maria," he'd explained during their uncomfortable phone conversation. "I've got my own mortgage to pay, and the property management company is pressuring me about delinquent tenants. If you can't bring the account current by October 15th, I'll have to proceed with formal eviction." That night, after Diego was asleep, Maria had sat at her kitchen table, surrounded by past due notices, job rejection letters, and eviction paperwork, trying to calculate options that didn't exist. Her sister Carmen had offered to help, but she had her own family to support and couldn't afford to subsidize Maria's rent indefinitely. Moving back in with her parents wasn't possible. They'd moved to a retirement community in Arizona with strict policies about long-term guests. The homeless shelter system in Billings could provide temporary housing. But the thought of subjecting Diego to that instability and uncertainty felt like admitting complete failure as a mother. She'd fought so hard to create a stable, secure life for him, and the idea of explaining why they'd have to sleep in unfamiliar places with strangers felt like a devastating betrayal of everything she'd promised him about their future together. It was during one of those sleepless nights, scrolling through job listings she'd already applied to multiple times, that she'd first discovered the world of online property auctions. A sidebar advertisement on a job search website had caught her attention: buy real estate for pennies on the dollar, government tax auctions. The concept seemed almost too simple. Properties with delinquent taxes were sold at public auctions to recover the unpaid amounts. Minimum bids were often just the outstanding tax debt, which could be a fraction of the property's actual value. With her construction background, she could potentially identify properties with good bones that could be restored and either lived in or resold for profit. The reality was more complex. Most auction properties were either in terrible condition, located in economically depressed areas, or carried legal complications that explained why their owners had stopped paying taxes. Properties in desirable locations attracted serious investors, with substantial resources driving prices well beyond what desperate individuals could afford. But there were exceptions: properties so remote, so damaged, or so legally complicated that they attracted minimal interest. Properties that might be perfect for someone with construction skills, unlimited time, and absolutely nothing to lose. Maria had spent hours studying auction listings across multiple states, learning to identify properties that might offer genuine opportunities rather than expensive mistakes. She'd developed criteria: structural integrity more important than cosmetic condition, legal title clear of major complications, access to basic utilities possible, even if not currently connected, and isolation acceptable since she couldn't afford to be picky about neighborhoods. The Glacier County, Montana auction had been her third attempt. She'd bid unsuccessfully on a cabin in Idaho sold for $1,200 to a cash buyer, and a small house in Wyoming discovered to have foundation problems that would cost more to fix than the structure was worth. Each failed attempt had consumed time and emotional energy she couldn't afford to waste. But it also educated her about the process and helped her refine her evaluation criteria. When she'd found the Silverbrook mining claim listing buried on page 12 of Glacier County's October auction, something about it had immediately captured her attention. Not just the $500 minimum bid that matched her available resources, but the combination of historical significance, solid construction materials, and the mysterious pattern of failed ownership transfers that suggested there might be more to the property than its modest listing indicated. The 3 days she'd spent researching the property at the Billings Public Library had been among the most focused, intensive investigative work she'd ever done. Using the library's free internet access and historical databases, she'd traced ownership records, geological surveys, newspaper archives, and even old mining company reports to understand the property's history and potential. What she'd discovered had been both encouraging and puzzling. The cabin's construction quality appeared exceptional for its age, suggesting someone had invested significantly in creating a permanent, durable structure. The historical mining operations had been successful enough to sustain continuous operation for over 20 years, indicating the area had genuine mineral value. And the mysterious circumstances surrounding both Jeremiah Whitmore's disappearance and Augustus Brennan's death suggested secrets that might still be relevant nearly a century later. But it was the pattern of failed ownership transfers that had convinced her this property might represent a genuine opportunity. If powerful interests had been trying to acquire the land for decades without success, there must be something valuable enough to justify their persistent efforts. And if legal obstacles had prevented those acquisitions, her purchase through the tax auction process might provide a pathway to ownership that had been unavailable through normal real estate channels. The decision to bid had been made at 11:43 p.m. on October 10th, 4 minutes before the auction deadline. Diego slept on their couch because the electricity had been turned off earlier that day. She'd sat in her dark apartment, illuminated only by her laptop screen and the streetlight filtering through their windows, weighing the risk of spending her last $500 on what might be a worthless property against the certainty of homelessness. If she did nothing, it's 11:47 p.m., she'd submitted her bid along with payment authorization, then spent the rest of the night alternating between terror about what she'd done and desperate hope that she'd somehow found a solution to their impossible situation. The confirmation email had arrived at 6:23 a.m. Congratulations! Your bid of $500 for property number 847 has been accepted. Title transfer documentation will be processed within 48 hours. 23 words that had completely changed the trajectory of her life and Diego's future. Now, sitting by the fireplace in her newly acquired cabin, listening to wind through the pines and the settling sounds of a 120-year-old building, Maria was beginning to understand that her desperate gamble had given her something more complex than just shelter. She owned 2.7 acres of Montana wilderness, a historic structure with genuine character and potential, and most importantly, it's time to figure out their next steps without the immediate pressure of rent payments and eviction notices. The challenges were obvious and daunting. The cabin needed extensive restoration before it would be truly habitable. She'd need to establish basic utilities, repair the roof, replace windows, and address dozens of other issues before winter made the structure truly livable. They'd be living in one of the most remote locations in the state, miles from schools, medical care, and employment opportunities. But for the first time in months, Maria felt like she had some control over their situation. Her construction background gave her the skills to tackle most of the restoration work herself, reducing costs while improving the property's value. The isolation that might discourage others actually appealed to her no neighbors to complain about construction noise. No homeowners association restrictions, no city ordinances limiting what she could do with her own property. She owned something valuable that couldn't be taken away by corporate downsizing. Economic recessions, or landlords preferring tenants with steady incomes. Whatever challenges lay ahead, she and Diego would face them as property owners, with the security and dignity that came from having a place that truly belonged to them. As the fire burned down to glowing coals and the mountain night deepened, around the cabin, Maria made mental lists of priorities for the coming days. First, she needed to get the generator working to provide basic electrical power. Then establish a reliable water source, whether by repairing existing well equipment or installing a new system. After that, she could begin the systematic restoration. That would transform this abandoned mining cabin into a real home for herself and Diego. But underlying all her practical planning was a growing sense that this property held secrets beyond its obvious restoration potential. The quality of construction, the mysterious history, the pattern of failed ownership transfers, and even the carved inscription beside the door all suggested that Jeremiah Whitmore and Augustus Brennan had left behind more than just an abandoned cabin. Tomorrow Diego would arrive with Carmen, and Maria would need to focus on creating a safe, comfortable environment for her son, while beginning the enormous task of restoration. But tonight, in the solitude of her first evening as a Montana property owner, she allowed herself to wonder what other discoveries might be waiting in the hidden corners of this remarkable place. The last thought that crossed her mind before sleep was about the inscription beside the door. Fortune favors the bold. Whether that phrase would prove prophetic or ironic remained to be seen. But there was no question that her $500 gamble represented the boldest decision she'd ever made. In the morning, she'd begin learning whether fortune was indeed prepared to favor her courage, or whether boldness alone was insufficient to overcome the challenges that lay ahead. The sound of tires on gravel woke Maria at dawn, sending a jolt of panic through her as she scrambled from her sleeping bag beside the dying fireplace. Her first thought was that she'd somehow been discovered by authorities, would inform her that her property purchase had been invalid, that she was trespassing, that she and Diego would be homeless after all. But as she peered through one of the cabin's grimy windows, she saw Carmen's familiar blue Toyota Camry pulling into the clearing. With Diego's excited face pressed against the passenger window, her sister had driven through the night to bring Diego to their new home, and the sight of her son's eager expression made Maria realize that whatever challenges lay ahead, she'd made the right decision in taking this enormous gamble. "Mom, place is amazing," Diego shouted as he burst from the car, his 8-year-old energy immediately focused on exploring their surroundings. Carmen said, "We're going to live in a real log cabin like pioneers. Can I explore the forest? Are there bears? Is that a real mine over there?" Carmen emerged more slowly, her expression mixing concern and admiration as she surveyed the isolated cabin and the spectacular mountain landscape surrounding it. As Maria's older sister and the only family member who'd consistently supported her through the recent crisis, Carmen had agreed to drive Diego to Montana despite her obvious doubts about Maria's impulsive property purchase. "It's more remote than I expected," Carmen said quietly, pulling Maria aside while Maria had spent hours studying auction listings across multiple states and learning to identify properties that might offer genuine opportunities rather than expensive mistakes. She'd developed criteria, structural integrity more important than the concern in her sister's voice reflected Maria's own anxiety about the decision she'd made. In the daylight, the challenges seemed even more daunting than they had by firelight. The cabin was larger and more solidly built than she'd expected, but it was also more damaged than the auction photos had suggested. Several windows were completely missing their glass. The roof showed obvious signs of water damage in multiple areas. The front steps were so deteriorated they'd need to be completely rebuilt. But there was something else visible in the morning light that hadn't been apparent the night before. Evidence of the quality and thoughtfulness that had gone into the original construction. The logs were massive and expertly fitted with chinking that had been recently maintained despite the building's abandoned status. The foundation was not just solid but appeared to have been professionally engineered, with proper drainage and ventilation that had protected the structure from the moisture, problems that typically destroyed buildings of this age. Most intriguingly, she could see additional outbuildings that hadn't been mentioned in the auction listing, a substantial generator shed, what appeared to be a workshop or storage building, and the remains of what might have been a barn or equipment. Shelter. The property was much more extensive than she'd realized, suggesting that Jeremiah Whitmore had created not just a residence, but a complete operational base for his mining activities. "I know it looks overwhelming," Maria told Carmen, watching Diego examine the heavy wooden door with the fascination of a child discovering buried treasure. "But the construction is solid, and I can handle most of the restoration work myself. More importantly, it's ours. For the first time since I lost my job, we have something that belongs to us completely." Carmen nodded, though her expression remained worried. "I understand the appeal, Maria, and God knows you needed a solution to the rent problem. You're talking about raising Diego in one of the most remote locations in Montana, miles from schools, medical care, and employment opportunities. What happens if you get sick? What happens when winter comes and you're snowed in for weeks?" The questions were legitimate and reflected concerns Maria had been trying not to think about too deeply. She'd made this decision in desperation, with limited information and no realistic backup plan. But looking at Diego's excitement as he explored their property, and feeling the sense of ownership and possibility that came from actually controlling their living situation, she knew she couldn't second-guess herself now. "I'll figure it out," she said, with more confidence than she felt. "I've got construction skills, internet access for remote work possibilities, and enough savings from not paying rent to cover basic supplies for several months. This property has potential beyond just shelter. It could become something valuable if I approach the restoration systematically." What she didn't mention to Carmen was the growing sense that this property held secrets that might justify the risk she'd taken, the mysterious history, the quality construction that suggested significant investment, and the pattern of failed ownership transfers all pointed to hidden value that previous owners had been unable to access. After Carmen departed with promises to call daily and threats to drive back immediately if Maria needed help, Maria and Diego spent their first full day exploring their new property together. Diego's 8-year-old enthusiasm for adventure made him the perfect companion for investigating their unusual new home, and his questions forced Maria to look more carefully at details she might have otherwise overlooked. "Why is this door so heavy?" Diego asked, struggling to close the cabin's main entrance. "Because it was built to last," Maria explained, examining the iron hardware that looked original to the 1903 construction. "The people who lived here needed protection from weather, wild animals, and probably other threats we don't have to worry about anymore." "What kind of threats?" was a good question, and one that made Maria consider the implications of the cabin's almost fortress-like construction. The windows were small and positioned high on the walls, providing excellent views of the surrounding area while minimizing vulnerability to outside observation. The door was reinforced with iron bands and hardware that would resist forced entry. The walls were thick enough to provide significant protection from both weather and potential attackers. This wasn't just a residence, it was a defensive position designed by someone who expected to face serious challenges to their safety and security. The workshop building proved even more intriguing. Unlike the cabin, which showed obvious signs of long abandonment, the workshop appeared to have been recently maintained. The roof was intact, the door was properly sealed, and when Maria managed to force the rusted lock, the interior revealed an organized space filled with mining equipment, geological instruments, and what appeared to be a complete metalworking setup. "Mom, look at all this cool stuff," Diego called from a corner where he'd discovered a collection of rock samples, each carefully labeled and organized in wooden boxes. "Are these real gems?" Maria joined him, examining the samples with growing amazement. These weren't casual rock collection specimens, they were systematically cataloged geological samples, each labeled with coordinates, dates, and technical notations that suggested professional analysis. Many contained visible veins of metal that even her untrained eye could identify as potentially valuable. "I think these might be samples," she told Diego, though she was beginning to suspect they represented something much more significant than casual mineral collecting. The people who lived here were miners, and they probably used these samples to understand what kinds of metals they could find on the property. But as she examined the samples more closely, Maria began to notice something unusual about the dates on the labels. Rather than spanning the 20-year period when Jeremiah Whitmore had operated the Silverbrook mine, most of the samples were dated between 1924 and 1925, the brief period when Augustus Brennan had owned the property before his mysterious death. Even more intriguing, many of the samples were labeled with locations that didn't correspond to the visible mine entrance she could see in the distance. Instead, they referenced coordinates and elevations that seemed to indicate underground locations, much closer to the cabin itself. "Diego, I want you to stay close to me while we explore," she said, a growing sense of excitement mixing with caution. "This property has a lot of history, and we need to be careful about places that might not. Be safe." The generator shed proved to contain not just a portable power source, but a surprisingly sophisticated electrical system that appeared to have been recently serviced. The generator itself was a modern diesel unit that looked capable of powering the entire cabin, and the electrical panels and wiring showed evidence of professional installation within the last few years. Why would someone maintain the electrical system for an abandoned property? Maria wondered aloud, though Diego was more interested in the collection of fuel cans that suggested someone had been keeping the generator operational. The implications were unsettling. If the property had been truly abandoned since 1924, who had been maintaining the workshop and electrical systems? And why would someone invest in keeping these facilities operational while allowing the cabin itself to deteriorate? As they explored the property's boundaries, following old mining roads and deer trails through the surrounding forest, Maria began to understand the true scope of what she'd purchased. The 2.7 acres mentioned in the auction listing were just the core of a much larger historical mining claim that extended deep into the mountainside. Old survey markers, partially overgrown equipment sites, the remains of what appeared to be a narrow-gauge railway, suggested an operation much more extensive than she'd imagined. But it was Diego who made the discovery that would change everything. About Maria's understanding of their new property. "Mom, there's a weird door in the ground over here," he called from behind the cabin where he'd been investigating what appeared to be a root cellar or storage area. Maria joined him at what she'd initially dismissed as a simple storm shelter or food storage area, common to properties of this era. But as she cleared away decades of accumulated leaves and debris, she realized Diego had found something much more significant. The door was actually a heavy wooden hatch reinforced with iron bands, built into what appeared to be a concrete foundation that extended well beyond the visible entrance. The construction was professional quality. It's designed for both durability and concealment, and the hardware showed evidence of recent maintenance despite the camouflaged appearance. "It looks like a secret entrance to something," Diego said with the excitement of a child discovering buried treasure. "Can we open it?" Maria examined the hatch more carefully, her construction background helping her recognize the quality and sophistication of the engineering. This wasn't a simple route cellar. It was the entrance to something substantial, built with the same attention to durability and security that characterized the cabin itself. The lock was modern, probably installed within the last decade, but the mechanism was damaged and appeared to have been forced at some point in the recent past. With some effort and the use of tools from the workshop, Maria managed to lift the heavy hatch, revealing a set of stone steps descending into darkness beneath the property. "Stay back while I check this out," she told Diego, though her own curiosity was overwhelming her caution. Using the flashlight from her emergency kit, she peered into the passage. Seeing expertly constructed stone walls and what appeared to be a level floor extending beyond the reach of her light, the air rising from the passage was surprisingly fresh, suggesting adequate ventilation. And there was no evidence of the flooding or structural collapse that might make exploration dangerous. Most remarkably, the construction quality was exceptional. This wasn't a crude mining tunnel, but a professionally engineered passage built to last centuries. "It's like a secret tunnel," Diego whispered, though Maria's construction experience was telling her this represented something much more significant than a simple underground storage area. The decision to explore further wasn't really a decision at all. It was an irresistible compulsion driven by curiosity, desperation. and the growing certainty that her $500 property purchase had given her access to secrets that previous owners had died protecting. "We're going to explore this together," she told Diego, "but we're going to be extremely careful, and if I say we leave immediately, we leave immediately. Understood?" Diego's enthusiastic agreement was accompanied by the kind of excitement that made Maria realized this adventure was exactly what both of them needed after months of financial stress and uncertainty. Whatever lay beneath their property, discovering it together would be the kind of experience that created lifelong memories and strengthened their bond as a family. The stone steps were worn smooth by decades of use, but remained structurally sound. As they descended into the passage, Maria's flashlight revealed walls that showed the same quality, craftsmanship evident in the cabin's construction. This wasn't a hastily excavated mining tunnel, it was a carefully planned and professionally built underground facility. 20 feet below ground level, the passage opened into a chamber that made Maria gasp with amazement. The room was roughly 15 feet square, with stone walls that rose to an arched ceiling supported by expertly fitted keystones. The floor was level and dry, and the air quality suggested a ventilation system that was still functioning after nearly a century. But it was the contents of the chamber that truly amazed her. Along one wall stood filing cabinets and document storage that appeared to have been recently organized. A large wooden table dominated the center of the room, its surface covered with maps, geological surveys, and technical drawings that looked both historical and remarkably well preserved. "Mom, this is like finding a treasure cave," Diego exclaimed, though he stayed close to her side as they explored the chamber with growing wonder. Maria approached the table carefully, using her flashlight to examine the documents without disturbing their arrangement. What she saw made her heart race with excitement and apprehension. These weren't just historical mining records, they were detailed geological surveys, quality analyses, and extraction plans that appeared to document discoveries far more significant than anything she'd imagined. The maps showed the property's underground structure in incredible detail, revealing a network of passages and chambers that extended deep into the mountainside. The geological surveys contained technical language that was beyond her understanding, but the yield estimates and value calculations were clear enough to make her hands tremble as she read them. According to these documents, the Silverbrook mining claim contained gold deposits worth potentially millions of dollars, hidden in geological formations that the original surface mining had never accessed. Augustus Brennan hadn't died in a mining accident. He'd discovered secrets that someone had been willing to kill to protect. "Diego," she said quietly, trying to keep the excitement and fear out of her voice, "I think we've found something very important. Something that's going to change our lives completely." As she continued examining the documents, Maria began to understand that her desperate $500 gamble had given her ownership of something far more valuable than an abandoned cabin and 2.7 acres of Montana wilderness. She'd purchased the key to a century-old mystery, access to discoveries that powerful interests had been trying to suppress for decades, and potentially the solution to every financial problem she'd ever faced. But the documents also made clear that previous owners had paid the ultimate price for these discoveries. If the patterns documented in these underground files were accurate, her ownership of this property would soon attract attention from forces much more dangerous than unemployment, eviction notices, or financial desperation. The pivotal decision wasn't whether to explore these discoveries further. That choice had been made the moment she'd opened the hidden hatch. The decision was whether she had the courage and intelligence to protect what she'd found while using it to create the secure future she'd always wanted for herself and Diego. Standing in that underground chamber, surrounded by evidence of discoveries that had cost previous owners their lives, Maria Santos made the commitment that would define the rest of her journey. She would honor the legacy of Jeremiah Whitmore and Augustus Brennan by completing what they'd started, while ensuring that this time, the rightful owner would survive to benefit from the secrets hidden beneath the Montana wilderness. The treasure hunt was just beginning. But Maria was no longer the desperate single mother who'd made a $500 gamble out of desperation. She was now the guardian of secrets worth millions, the inheritor of a mystery nearly a century in the making. and the only person positioned to finally reveal the truth about the Silverbrook mining claim. Tomorrow would bring new challenges and discoveries. But tonight she would plan her next steps with the systematic approach that had made her an excellent project manager and would now make her a formidable protector of the legacy that had chosen her as its guardian. The morning after discovering the underground chamber, Maria woke before dawn with the hyper-alert clarity that comes from life-changing revelations. Diego was still sleeping peacefully in his makeshift bed near the fireplace, but her mind had been racing all night with the implications of what they'd found beneath their property. The documents in the hidden chamber had kept her awake for hours, not because she could fully understand their technical content, but because the patterns they revealed were both thrilling and terrifying. According to Augustus Brennan's meticulous records, the Silverbrook mining claim contained gold deposits that would be worth tens of millions of dollars at current market prices. But those same documents also detailed systematic attempts to suppress his discoveries, culminating in what appeared to be his murder disguised as a mining accident. As she quietly prepared coffee over the camp stove she'd brought from Billings, Maria tried to process the magnitude of her situation. 3 days ago, she'd been facing eviction and homelessness. Now she owned property containing one of the largest undiscovered gold deposits in Montana, complete with evidence that powerful interests had been willing to kill to control access to those resources. The rational part of her mind insisted this was too good to be true, as the desperate people often convinced themselves they'd found miraculous solutions to impossible problems. But her construction background helped her recognize the quality and authenticity of what she'd discovered. The underground chamber wasn't the fantasyland creation of delusional prospectors. It was a professionally engineered facility built by people with significant resources and expertise. More convincingly, the maintenance and upkeep evident throughout. The property suggested that someone with substantial knowledge and ongoing access had been protecting these discoveries for decades. The generator, electrical systems, and workshop hadn't maintained themselves. Someone had been waiting for the right moment to develop these resources. Their successful purchase of the property through the tax auction had apparently triggered that moment. "Mom, are we going to explore more of the secret tunnels today?" Diego asked as he emerged from his sleeping bag, his 8-year-old enthusiasm undiminished by a night sleeping on a cabin floor. "We're going to explore very carefully," Maria replied, though she was as eager as Diego to continue their underground investigations. "But first we need to understand exactly what we found yesterday and make sure it's safe for further exploration." She'd decided to approach their discoveries with the same systematic methodology she'd used managing construction projects. Before proceeding with any major excavation or development, she needed to assess structural integrity, identify potential hazards, document existing conditions, and develop a comprehensive plan that would protect both their safety and their legal interests. After breakfast, they returned to the hidden chamber with better lighting and basic tools from the workshop. In the improved visibility provided by a battery-powered lantern, Maria could see details that had been obscured by flashlight. The previous evening, the chamber wasn't just a single room. Passages extended in at least 3 directions, suggesting an underground network much more extensive than she'd initially realized. The construction quality was even more impressive in full light. Stone walls showed expert masonry work with precisely fitted joints that had remained tight and waterproof for nearly a century. The arched ceiling demonstrated sophisticated engineering knowledge. The ventilation system was cleverly designed to provide fresh air circulation without creating obvious surface openings that might reveal the chamber's existence. But it was the documents and maps that provided the most crucial information about their discovery. Augustus Brennan had been far more than a simple mining engineer. His credentials included advanced degrees in geology and metallurgy, along with experience working for major mining companies across the western United States. His analysis of the Silverbrook property had been exhaustive and professional, involving core sampling, geological surveying, and metallurgical testing that far exceeded anything typically done for small mining claims. "Look at this map, Diego," Maria said, spreading one of Brennan's detailed drawings across the chamber's wooden table. "This shows passages and rooms that extend way deeper into the mountain than we've explored so far." The map revealed an underground complex that included multiple chambers, storage areas, and what appeared to be an actual mining operation that accessed gold veins through tunnels that connected to the original Silverbrook mine. But unlike Jeremiah, Whitmore's surface mining, which had focused on silver deposits near the mountainside. Brennan's work had identified much richer gold formations deeper underground. According to his notes, Whitmore had been working the wrong mineral deposits entirely. The silver he'd extracted for 20 years was valuable, but relatively modest compared to the gold veins that lay deeper in the mountain.
Ouch.
Expertise had allowed him to identify these richer deposits and develop extraction plans that would have made the Silverbrook claim one of the most valuable mining properties in Montana. "Why didn't he dig up all the gold?" Diego asked, studying the maps with the focused attention that 8-year-olds brought to treasure hunting scenarios. "Because someone stopped him," Maria replied, though the full implications of Brennan's fate were becoming clearer as she read through his documentation. The people who wanted to take control of this property made sure he couldn't develop it himself. Brennan's files contained correspondence that detailed escalating pressure from multiple sources during the final months of his life. Mining companies had made increasingly aggressive offers to purchase the property, backed by threats about what might happen if he refused to sell. Government officials had visited repeatedly, claiming authority to seize the property under various regulatory pretexts. Even local law enforcement had been compromised, with evidence suggesting that sheriff's deputies were being paid to monitor Brennan's activities and report his discoveries to outside interests. The pattern was remarkably similar to what Maria had read about in her research on the property's history. Powerful entities had identified the true value of the Silverbrook claim and had implemented systematic campaigns to gain control through methods that ranged from financial pressure to legal manipulation to outright threats. But Brennan had been prepared for such tactics. His engineering background and connections within the mining industry had taught him to anticipate attempts to seize valuable discoveries. And he'd implemented what he called asset preservation protocols, designed to protect his findings until they could be safely developed. The underground chamber was just the beginning of Brennan's preservation system. As Maria and Diego explored the passages extending from the main room, they discovered additional chambers that contained increasingly sophisticated evidence of Brennan's preparations for protecting his discovery. The first secondary chamber contained geological samples and metallurgical equipment that represented a complete laboratory for analyzing or quality and planning extraction procedures. The samples were organized with scientific precision, each labeled with location coordinates, extraction dates, and detailed analysis results that documented gold concentrations far exceeding anything Maria had imagined possible. "Have real gold in them," Diego exclaimed, examining samples that showed visible veins of precious metal running through quartz formations. "More gold than most professional mining operations ever find," Maria confirmed, reading Brennan's analysis notes that indicated ore grades of several ounces per ton concentrations that would justify major commercial development even with 1920s extraction technology. The second chamber contained something even more remarkable: a complete workshop with mining equipment, metalworking tools, and what appeared to be a small-scale or processing facility. Brennan hadn't just identified the gold deposits, he'd begun extracting and refining them. It's producing refined gold that he'd stored in a secure vault built into the chamber's back wall. The vault itself was a masterpiece of 1920s engineering, with a combination lock system that had protected its contents for nearly a century. The mechanism was complex, but still functional. And after careful examination of Brennan's notes, Maria managed to determine the combination based on coordinates and dates that appeared throughout his documentation. Inside the vault, they found proof that Brennan's discoveries were genuine and substantial. Gold bars, each precisely marked with weight and purity measurements, filled multiple shelves within the secure storage area. Even conservative estimates suggested the vault contained several $100,000 worth of refined gold. And this represented only a fraction of what Brennan's maps indicated was available from deeper mining operations. "Mom, are we rich now?" Diego asked with the directness that children brought to complex situations. "We might be," Maria replied, though she was beginning to understand that wealth derived from these discoveries would come with challenges that could be as dangerous as their previous poverty. But we need to be very careful about how we handle this discovery. The people who stopped Augustus Brennan from developing this property might still be around. They probably won't be happy that someone else now has access to what they wanted. The third chamber provided the most crucial information about the threats they might face. Brennan had documented everything about the campaign to seize control of his property, creating a detailed record of the individuals, companies, and government agencies that had been involved in the effort to force him to surrender his discoveries. The primary corporate interest had been represented by something called Western Mining Consortium, which appeared to be a coalition of major mining companies that specialized in acquiring valuable properties through aggressive tactics that sometimes exceeded legal boundaries. The consortium had offered substantial payments for the property, but when Brennan had refused to sell, they'd escalated to threats, sabotage, and ultimately what appeared to be murder. Government involvement had come through multiple agencies, including the Bureau of Land Management, the U.S. Geological Survey, and even military representatives who claimed the property had strategic importance that justified federal seizure. The justifications had ranged from environmental protection to national security. But Brennan's notes made clear that the real motivation was controlling access to gold deposits that could influence national economic policy. Local corruption had been extensive, involving county officials, law enforcement, and even judges who had been compromised through bribes or threats. Brennan's documentation suggested that virtually every local authority figure had been either bought or intimidated into supporting the effort to seize his property. But most disturbing was evidence that the campaign against Brennan had been coordinated and systematic, involving resources and expertise that suggested institutional involvement rather than simply private corporate interests. The Western Mining Consortium appeared to have connections to federal agencies and political figures that gave them access to government authority for suppressing discoveries that might threaten established economic interests. The good news, Maria told Diego, as they explored Brennan's comprehensive documentation, is that he wrote down everything about the people who were trying to take his property. If they try the same tactics against us, we'll know exactly what to expect. The bad news, which she didn't share with Diego, was that Brennan's meticulous documentation had been insufficient to protect him from people willing to commit murder to control valuable resources. His death had been carefully arranged to look accidental, but his notes made clear that he'd been expecting an attempt on his life and had taken precautions to ensure his discoveries would survive even if he didn't. The most important of those precautions was a legal framework that Brennan had established to protect the property from seizure even after his death. Working with attorneys in Denver and San Francisco who specialized in mining law, he'd created a complex trust structure that made it virtually impossible for outside interests to gain control of the property through normal legal channels. The trust documents stored in a fireproof safe within the vault chamber revealed that Brennan had anticipated exactly the kind of legal limbo that had kept the property unavailable for nearly a century. His death had triggered automatic provisions that tied up ownership in deliberate legal complications designed to prevent seizure, while preserving the property for a future owner who would be positioned to develop the discoveries safely. It's like he knew someone like us would eventually find this place, Diego observed, though the 8-year-old couldn't fully understand the sophisticated legal planning that had protected their discovery for nearly a century. I think that's exactly what he planned, Maria replied, reading through trust documents that seemed almost prophetic in their anticipation of her circumstances. He created a system that would keep this property safe until the right person could take control of it. Brennan's selection criteria had been remarkably specific. The trust provisions required that the eventual owner demonstrate financial desperation sufficient to motivate the risks involved in protecting valuable discoveries, construction or technical expertise adequate to understand and develop the resources, and family responsibilities that would provide motivation for long-term commitment rather than quick profit-taking. Maria met all of those criteria perfectly, suggesting that her successful purchase of the property hadn't been coincidental. Brennan's legal framework had been designed to identify and select exactly the kind of person who would be willing to protect his legacy while being capable of completing the work he'd been forced to abandon. As they spent the afternoon exploring, Deeper into the underground complex, Maria began to understand the true scope of what Brennan had discovered and prepared. But most disturbing was evidence that the campaign against Brennan had been coordinated and systematic, involving resources and expertise that suggested institutional involvement rather than simply private corporate interests. The Western Mining Consortium appeared to have connections to federal agencies and political figures that gave them access to government authority for suppressing discoveries that might threaten established economic interests. The good news, Maria told Diego, as they explored Brennan's comprehensive documentation, is that he wrote down everything about the people who were trying to take his property. If they try the same tactics against us, we'll know exactly what to expect. The bad news, which she didn't share with Diego, was that Brennan's meticulous documentation had been insufficient to protect him from people willing to commit murder to control valuable resources. His death had been carefully arranged to look accidental, but his notes made clear that he'd been expecting an attempt on his life and had taken precautions to ensure his discoveries would survive even if he didn't. The most important of those precautions was a legal framework that Brennan had established to protect the property from seizure even after his death. Working with attorneys in Denver and San Francisco who specialized in mining law, he'd created a complex trust structure that made it virtually impossible for outside interests to gain control of the property through normal legal channels. The trust documents stored in a fireproof safe within the vault chamber revealed that Brennan had anticipated exactly the kind of legal limbo that had kept the property unavailable for nearly a century. His death had triggered automatic provisions that tied up ownership in deliberate legal complications designed to prevent seizure, while preserving the property for a future owner who would be positioned to develop the discoveries safely. It's like he knew someone like us would eventually find this place, Diego observed, though the 8-year-old couldn't fully understand the sophisticated legal planning that had protected their discovery for nearly a century. I think that's exactly what he planned, Maria replied, reading through trust documents that seemed almost prophetic in their anticipation of her circumstances. He created a system that would keep this property safe until the right person could take control of it. Brennan's selection criteria had been remarkably specific. The trust provisions required that the eventual owner demonstrate financial desperation sufficient to motivate the risks involved in protecting valuable discoveries, construction or technical expertise adequate to understand and develop the resources, and family responsibilities that would provide motivation for long-term commitment rather than quick profit-taking. Maria met all of those criteria perfectly, suggesting that her successful purchase of the property hadn't been coincidental. Brennan's legal framework had been designed to identify and select exactly the kind of person who would be willing to protect his legacy while being capable of completing the work he'd been forced to abandon. As they spent the afternoon exploring deeper into the underground complex, Maria began to understand the true scope of what Brennan had discovered and prepared. The passages extended nearly a quarter-mile into the mountainside, accessing multiple gold veins that his geological surveys indicated could yield millions of ounces of precious metal over decades of systematic extraction. But more remarkably, Brennan had begun developing the infrastructure necessary for commercial-scale mining operations. The deeper chambers contained equipment, rail systems, and processing facilities that represented millions of dollars of investment in 1920s terms. He'd been planning not just to extract the gold, but to develop the entire property as a major mining operation that could have competed with the largest commercial mines in Montana. The engineering was sophisticated and comprehensive, demonstrating expertise that went far beyond typical prospecting or small-scale mining. Brennan had designed ventilation systems, transportation, but most disturbing was evidence that the campaign against Brennan had been coordinated and systematic, involving resources and expertise that suggested institutional involvement rather than simply private corporate interests. The Western Mining Consortium appeared to have connections to federal agencies and political figures that gave them access to government authority for suppressing discoveries that might threaten established economic interests. The good news, Maria told Diego, as they explored Brennan's comprehensive documentation, is that he wrote down everything about the people who were trying to take his property. If they try the same tactics against us, we'll know exactly what to expect. The bad news, which she didn't share with Diego, was that Brennan's meticulous documentation had been insufficient to protect him from people willing to commit murder to control valuable resources. His death had been carefully arranged to look accidental, but his notes made clear that he'd been expecting an attempt on his life and had taken precautions to ensure his discoveries would survive even if he didn't. The most important of those precautions was a legal framework that Brennan had established to protect the property from seizure even after his death. Working with attorneys in Denver and San Francisco who specialized in mining law, he'd created a complex trust structure that made it virtually impossible for outside interests to gain control of the property through normal legal channels. The trust documents stored in a fireproof safe within the vault chamber revealed that Brennan had anticipated exactly the kind of legal limbo that had kept the property unavailable for nearly a century. His death had triggered automatic provisions that tied up ownership in deliberate legal complications designed to prevent seizure, while preserving the property for a future owner who would be positioned to develop the discovery safely. "It's like he knew someone like us would eventually find this place," Diego observed, though the 8-year-old couldn't fully. The explanation was plausible enough to seem legitimate, but the timing of his visit, just days after her property purchase and coinciding with her discovery of Brennan's underground complex, suggested knowledge that went beyond publicly available information. "How did you know I was here?" Maria asked directly. "This property just changed ownership, and I haven't registered with any local authorities or made contact with historical preservation organizations." Blackwood's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm Maria's suspicions that his visit wasn't based on routine monitoring of property transfers. "We maintain ongoing relationships with county assessor offices throughout the region," he replied smoothly. "Historical mining properties require specialized expertise, and we make it our business to ensure new owners understand the challenges and opportunities associated with their acquisitions." The answer was technically believable but felt rehearsed, as if Blackwood had prepared explanations for questions he expected to be asked. More concerning was the way his associates had positioned themselves to observe all approaches to the property, while maintaining clear sight lines to the cabin and surrounding buildings. "I appreciate your concern," Maria said carefully, "but I'm quite capable of assessing my own property and addressing any safety issues that might arise. I have extensive construction experience, and I'm familiar with the precautions necessary for working around historic structures." Blackwood's expression shifted slightly, suggesting he hadn't expected informed resistance to his offer of assistance. "Miss Santos, I understand your desire to maintain independence, but this property presents challenges that go beyond typical construction or renovation projects. The Silverbrook mining claim has a complex history involving multiple attempts at development that were unsuccessful due to geological instabilities and environmental complications." He paused, studying her reaction to see if his warnings were having the intended effect. "More importantly, there are legal and regulatory issues associated with mining properties that can create a significant liability for inexperienced owners. Titan has the expertise and resources to navigate these complications while ensuring you receive fair compensation for any development rights you might choose to transfer." The offer was presented as helpful advice, but Maria could hear the underlying message clearly enough. Blackwood was informing her that this property came with problems beyond her ability to handle, and that selling to his company was her best option for avoiding those difficulties. "What kind of compensation are we talking about?" she asked, though her question was motivated more by curiosity about how much they thought the property was worth than by any interest in selling. Blackwood's smile returned, though it remained professionally calculated rather than genuinely friendly. Given the property's remote location, the condition of existing structures, and the specialized expertise required for proper development, Titan would be prepared to offer $150,000 for complete transfer of ownership and all associated mineral rights. The figure was substantial enough to solve every financial problem she'd faced and provide security for herself and Diego that would last for years. But it was also far less than what Augustus Brennan's documentation suggested the property was actually worth. And Blackwood's eagerness to make such an offer confirmed that Titan knew about discoveries she hadn't mentioned. "That's a generous offer for a property I purchased for $500 just a few days ago," Maria replied, watching Blackwood's reaction carefully. "But I'm not interested in selling. This property represents stability and opportunity for my family, and I plan to develop it myself." Blackwood's professional composure remained intact, but something in his expression suggested he'd been expecting resistance and had prepared for more aggressive persuasion tactics. "Santos, I hope you'll consider the realities of your situation. Before making a final decision, this property is extremely isolated, with no access to emergency services, reliable utilities, or the infrastructure necessary for safe habitation. You're a single mother with limited resources, attempting to establish residency in one of the most challenging environments in Montana." The shift in tone was subtle but unmistakable. Blackwood was no longer offering assistance, he was pointing out her vulnerabilities. "More importantly," he continued, "historic mining properties are subject to federal oversight and environmental regulations that can result in significant penalties for improper development or disturbance of protected sites. The legal complications alone could cost you far more than you paid for the property." The threats were carefully disguised as warnings. But Maria understood that Blackwood was informing her about obstacles that his company could create if she refused to cooperate with their plans. Before she could respond, Diego appeared in the doorway behind her, apparently curious about the visitors who'd interrupted their morning routine. "Mom, who are these people?" he asked with the directness that 8-year-olds brought to adult situations they didn't understand. Blackwood's attention shifted to Diego with an intensity that made Maria's protective instincts flare immediately. There was something calculating in the way he assessed her son, as if Diego represented leverage that could be used to influence her decision-making. "This must be your son," Blackwood said, his tone becoming warmer in a way that felt predatory rather than friendly. "It's admirable that you want to provide him with adventure and independence, but this location presents serious risks for a child. Medical emergencies, wildlife encounters, extreme weather, these are real dangers that responsible parents need to consider." The message was clear. Her decision to remain on the property wasn't just affecting her own safety, but was potentially endangering Diego. It was exactly the kind of emotional manipulation that Maria had learned to recognize and resist during her months of dealing with creditors and bureaucrats who use guilt and fear to pressure people into compliance. "Diego and I are quite capable of managing the challenges of rural living," she replied firmly. "We've made our decision to build our future here, and we're prepared to handle whatever difficulties that might involve." He'd expected her response, but his expression suggested the conversation was far from over. "I understand your position, Miss Santos, but I hope you'll keep Titan's offer in mind as you begin to understand the full scope of what you've taken on. We'll maintain our interest in this property, and our offer will remain available if circumstances change your perspective." He turned to leave, then paused as if remembering something important. "One final piece of advice," he said, looking directly at her with an expression that was no longer attempting to seem friendly. "Historic mining properties often attract attention from treasure hunters, amateur prospectors." The explanation was plausible enough to seem legitimate. But the timing of his visit, just days after her property purchase and coinciding with her discovery of Brennan's underground complex, suggested knowledge that went beyond publicly available information. "How did you know I was here?" Maria asked directly. "This property just changed ownership, and I haven't registered with any local authorities or made contact with historical preservation organizations." Blackwood's hesitation lasted only a fraction of a second, but it was enough to confirm Maria's suspicions that his visit wasn't based on routine monitoring of property transfers. "We maintain ongoing relationships with county assessor offices throughout the region," he replied smoothly. "Historical mining properties require specialized expertise, and we make it our business to ensure new owners understand the challenges and opportunities associated with their acquisitions." The answer was technically believable but felt rehearsed, as if Blackwood had prepared explanations for questions he expected to be asked. More concerning was the way his associates had positioned themselves to observe all approaches to the property, while maintaining clear sight lines to the cabin and surrounding buildings. "I appreciate your concern," Maria said carefully, "but I'm quite capable of assessing my own property and addressing any safety issues that might arise. I have extensive construction experience, and I'm familiar with the precautions necessary." For working around historic structures, Blackwood's expression shifted slightly, suggesting he hadn't expected informed resistance to his offer of assistance. "Miss Santos, I understand your desire to maintain independence, but this property presents challenges that go beyond typical construction or renovation projects. The Silverbrook mining claim has a complex history involving multiple attempts at development that were unsuccessful due to geological instabilities and environmental complications." He paused, studying her reaction to see if his warnings were having the intended effect. More importantly, there are legal and regulatory issues associated with mining properties that can create a significant liability for inexperienced owners. Titan has the expertise and resources to navigate these complications while ensuring you receive fair compensation for any development rights you might choose to transfer. The offer was presented as helpful advice, but Maria could hear the underlying message clearly enough. Blackwood was informing her that this property came with problems beyond, but Brennan had also documented Titan's vulnerabilities and limitations. Their aggressive tactics created legal exposure that could be exploited by opponents with sufficient knowledge and resources. Their political connections were maintained through relationships that could be disrupted by public exposure of their methods. And their corporate structure, while complex, contained weaknesses that could be attacked through proper legal strategies. Most importantly, Brennan had discovered that Titan's greatest weakness was their dependence on secrecy and legal manipulation, rather than legitimate business practices. When forced to operate in full public view with proper legal oversight and media attention, their ability to seize valuable properties was significantly reduced. The challenge was surviving long enough to expose their methods while protecting the discoveries that justified their aggressive interest in the Silverbrook property. Over the following days, Maria implemented security measures based on Brennan's recommendations and her own assessment of the threats they faced. She installed motion-activated cameras around the property perimeter, established communication protocols with Carmen and other trusted contacts, and created emergency procedures that would allow her and Diego to reach safety if their situation became dangerous. More importantly, she began documenting everything about their discoveries and the circumstances surrounding Titan's interest in their property. Following Brennan's example, she created detailed records that would preserve evidence of valuable resources and illegal suppression attempts even if something happened to her. But it was Diego who provided the most crucial insight into their situation. During one of their evening conversations by the fireplace, "Mom, why don't we tell everyone about the treasure we found?" he asked with the logical directness that children brought to complex problems. Lots of people knew about it. The scary men couldn't take it away from us. The suggestion was brilliant in its simplicity and aligned perfectly with Brennan's analysis of Titan's vulnerabilities. Their power depended on operating in secrecy, using legal manipulation and bureaucratic pressure to seize valuable properties without public scrutiny. But if their methods and objectives became public knowledge, their ability to suppress discoveries would be significantly compromised. "That's exactly what we're going to do," Maria told Diego, though she knew the process would be far more complex and dangerous than he could understand. "We're going to make sure everyone knows about our discoveries, and the people who are trying to take them away from us. The decision to go public with their discoveries would require careful planning and strategic thinking that went far beyond her construction management experience. She would need legal representation, media contacts, and political support that could protect them from retaliation while ensuring their story received the attention necessary to provide security through public exposure." But for the first time since Blackwood's threatening visit, Maria felt like she had a viable strategy for protecting both their discoveries and their safety. Augustus Brennan had been forced to operate in isolation without the communication, tools and media resources that would be available to her nearly a century later. She had advantages he couldn't have imagined, and she intended to use them to complete what he'd started, while ensuring that this time the rightful owners would survive to benefit from their discoveries. 3 weeks after Blackwood's visit, Maria was ready to implement the strategy that would either secure their future or expose them to dangers that could cost them everything. She'd retained legal representation from a Denver firm that specialized in mining law and had established contact with investigative journalists who covered corporate malfeasance and government corruption. Most importantly, she'd created a comprehensive documentation package that detailed their discoveries, Brennan's historical evidence, and Titan's aggressive tactics. Distributing copies to multiple trusted contacts with instructions for public release if anything happened to her or Diego. The battle for control of the Silverbrook mining claim was about to move from threats and intimidation to public exposure and legal confrontation. Maria Santos, former construction project manager, desperate single mother, now guardian of a century-old treasure, was prepared to fight for her family's future using weapons that Augustus Brennan had never possessed: the power of public scrutiny and modern communication technology. Standing in the underground chamber that had preserved these secrets for 99 years, surrounded by evidence of discoveries worth millions of dollars and documentation of the forces that had killed to control them, Maria made the final commitment that would determine whether she and Diego would join the ranks of victims who'd been silenced by powerful interests, or become the first people to successfully challenge the system that had suppressed these discoveries for nearly a century. The treasure hunt was complete, but the real battle was just beginning. And this time, the outcome would be determined not by whoever was willing to use the most extreme violence, but by whoever could most effectively use the tools of democracy, legal justice, and public accountability to protect discoveries that belong to the American people rather than corporate interests willing to commit murder to control valuable resources. Maria Santos had found more than gold beneath her $500 cabin. She'd discovered the power to challenge a system of suppression that had operated in darkness for nearly a century. Whether she would survive to benefit from that discovery remained to be seen, but her commitment to protecting her family's future and honoring Augustus Brennan's legacy was absolute. The struggling single mother who'd made a desperate $500 gamble to escape eviction had become the guardian of secrets that could change not just her own life, but the entire system of resource control that had kept valuable discoveries from benefiting the people who found them. Her journey from desperation to empowerment was complete, but her battle for justice was just beginning. In the flickering light of the underground chamber where Augustus Brennan had preserved his discoveries for nearly a century, Maria Santos prepared to step into the public spotlight that would either expose the truth about corporate suppression of valuable resources, or make her and Diego the latest victims of forces that had been killing to protect their secrets since 1924. The gold beneath their cabin was worth millions, but the truth they were prepared to reveal was priceless. Truth, Maria had learned, was the one weapon that even the most powerful corporate interests couldn't suppress forever. The story of the struggling single mother who bought a $500 abandoned cabin and found a secret tunnel to a gold mine was about to become the story of the brave family who exposed a century of corporate crime and government corruption if they lived long enough to tell it. 2 months after Maria's first encounter with Jonathan Blackwood, the battle for control of the Silverbrook mining claim reached its climactic moment on a cold December morning when federal agents, corporate security teams, and investigative journalists converged simultaneously on the remote Montana property that had become the center of a national scandal. The transformation in Maria's situation had been dramatic and swift once she'd implemented her strategy of public exposure. Working with Denver attorney Patricia Winters and investigative journalist Sarah Chen from the Montana Standard, Maria had methodically released evidence of Augustus Brennan's discoveries, Titan resource developments, century-long suppression, campaign, and the federal agencies that had been complicit in preventing legitimate property owners from developing valuable resources. The story had exploded across national media with the kind of intensity that comes from perfect timing and compelling human interest elements. A struggling single mother discovering treasure beneath an abandoned cabin was inherently fascinating. But the revelation that powerful corporate interests had been systematically murdering property owners to control valuable mining claims for nearly a century transformed the story into a national outrage. Congressional hearings had been demanded. Federal investigations had been launched. Titan Resource Development's stock price had collapsed as investors fled a company exposed as having built its wealth through fraud, intimidation, and murder. The carefully constructed network of political protection that had shielded the company's operations for decades crumbled under public scrutiny and media attention. But Titan had not surrendered quietly, as their legal and political defenses collapsed. They'd escalated to increasingly desperate tactics that culminated in the coordinated assault that was about to test whether Maria's strategy of public exposure could protect her family when powerful interests decided that silencing her permanently was worth the risk of additional public outrage. Maria woke at 5:30 a.m. to the sound of vehicles approaching the cabin from multiple directions. Through the pre-dawn darkness, she could see headlights moving along access roads she hadn't known existed, suggesting that someone with detailed knowledge of the property's layout was coordinating a comprehensive operation designed to prevent escape or outside interference. Her emergency protocols, developed based on Augustus Brennan's security recommendations and refined through months of escalating threats, activated immediately. A silent alarm alerted Patricia Winters, Sarah Chen, and FBI contacts who'd been monitoring the situation. Hidden cameras began transmitting live footage to secure servers that would preserve evidence regardless of what happened at the property. And Diego, awakened by their predetermined signal, moved to the underground safe room they'd prepared for exactly this scenario. "Mom, are the scary men coming back?" he asked with the composed bravery that 8-year-olds could display when they trusted their parents to handle dangerous situations. "Yes, but we're ready for them this time," Maria replied, though she knew the next few hours would determine whether her months of preparation had been sufficient to protect them from opponents who demonstrated they were willing to commit murder to achieve their objectives. The lead vehicle was a black SUV that Maria recognized as belonging to Titan's security team. But it was followed by federal agents in unmarked cars and what appeared to be a mobile command unit, equipped with sophisticated communication and surveillance equipment. The coordination between corporate and government forces confirmed Brennan's documentation about the institutional corruption that had protected Titan's operations for decades. Jonathan Blackwood emerged from the lead SUV with the same professional confidence he displayed during his first visit. But his demeanor now carried an edge of desperation that suggested a man whose carefully constructed world was collapsing. Around him, behind him, came federal agents, wearing tactical gear and carrying equipment that appeared designed for forced entry rather than routine investigation. "Miss Santos," Blackwood called out, approaching the cabin with obvious knowledge that she was monitoring his movements through the security system she'd installed. "We need to discuss the resolution of this situation before it escalates beyond anyone's ability to control." Maria stepped onto the porch, wearing a wireless microphone that would broadcast their conversation to the journalists and attorneys, who were documenting every aspect of Titan's final desperate gambit. She'd learned from Brennan's experience that allowing these confrontations to occur in secrecy gave opponents too many opportunities for violence and cover-ups. "Mr. Blackwood," she replied, her voice carrying clearly to the recording equipment, "that would preserve this conversation regardless of its outcome. I wasn't expecting such an elaborate visit. Are you here to discuss another generous offer for my property?" Blackwood's smile was strained, lacking even the pretense of friendliness that had characterized their previous interaction. "The situation has become more complex than simple property acquisition," he replied, glancing at the federal agents who were positioning themselves around the cabin with military precision. "Your recent media activities have created complications that require immediate resolution through proper legal channels." Behind him, Agent Jennifer Morrison, from the Bureau of Land Management, stepped forward with documentation that she held with the authority of someone accustomed to having federal power overcome private property rights. "Ms. Santos, I'm serving you with a federal seizure order for this property under the Historical Mining Sites Preservation Act," Morrison announced, extending an official-looking document. "Recent geological surveys have identified environmental hazards and historical artifacts that require immediate federal protection." The legal justification was carefully crafted to sound legitimate. But Maria had been expecting exactly this tactic based on Brennan's documentation of similar maneuvers used against previous property owners. "Agent Morrison, I assume you have?" Proper warrants and court orders authorizing this seizure? Maria asked, though she knew the question would expose the federal agent's legal vulnerability. Morrison's hesitation confirmed what Maria had suspected. This was an extra-legal operation that depended on intimidation and the assumption that isolated property owners would be unable to challenge federal authority effectively. The environmental and safety concerns justify immediate action under emergency provisions, Morrison replied, though her tone suggested less confidence than her words conveyed. Emergency provisions that weren't considered necessary during the 99 years. This property remained abandoned, Maria asked, making it clear that she understood the pretextual nature of their justifications. But it was the arrival of Sarah Chen and her camera crew that transformed the confrontation from a private intimidation session into a public spectacle that would be broadcast live to audiences across the nation. The investigative journalist had been monitoring the situation remotely and had positioned herself to document whatever final confrontation Titan might attempt. This is Sarah Chen reporting live from the Silverbrook mining claim in Montana, where federal agents are attempting to seize property from Maria Santos, the single mother whose discovery of a century-old treasure has exposed systematic corruption. In government mining oversight, Chen announced, her camera capturing the startled expressions of federal agents who'd expected to operate without media scrutiny. Blackwood's composure finally cracked as he realized that his carefully planned operation was being broadcast to national audiences in real time. Turn off those cameras immediately, he demanded, though he had no authority to control journalists operating on public access roads. Mr. Blackwood, can you explain why Titan Resource Development is coordinating with federal agents to seize property that your company has been trying to acquire through questionable means for nearly a century? Chen asked, positioning herself where her camera could capture both Blackwood's reaction and the federal agent's tactical positioning. The question exposed the coordination between corporate and government forces that Brennan's documentation had predicted but which had never been caught on live television during an actual seizure attempt. Agent Morrison attempted to regain control of the situation by approaching Maria with what appeared to be an arrest warrant. Ms. Santos, you're being charged with illegal excavation of protected historical sites and unlawful extraction of mineral resources from federal land, she announced, though her legal authority was questionable given that the property's title was clear and properly documented. But before Morrison could serve her warrant, Patricia Winters arrived with federal court documentation that stopped the seizure attempt in its tracks. Agent Morrison, I'm Patricia Winters representing Ms. Santos, and I have a federal court injunction prohibiting any seizure of this property pending resolution of the criminal investigation into Titan Resource Development's activities, Winters announced, presenting court orders that had been prepared for exactly this scenario. The injunction was supported by evidence that Maria and her legal team had been providing to federal prosecutors investigating Titan's century-long pattern of illegal property seizures, intimidation, and murder. The timing of the court order, delivered just as Titan was attempting their final desperate gambit, exposed their operation as exactly the kind of illegal conspiracy that had been documented in Brennan's files. Morrison examined the court documents with obvious frustration, realizing that her extra-legal seizure attempt had been anticipated and blocked through proper legal channels. This injunction doesn't supersede environmental and safety regulations, she argued, though her authority was clearly compromised. Actually, it does, Winters replied, particularly when those regulations are being applied, protectually to benefit private corporate interests that are under federal criminal investigation. The legal maneuvering was complex, but the essential point was clear to everyone present. Maria's strategy of public exposure and legal preparation had successfully prevented Titan from using the same tactics that had eliminated Augustus Brennan and countless other property owners over the previous century. But Blackwood wasn't finished. As his legal and bureaucratic options collapsed, he made one final attempt to intimidate Maria into surrendering her discoveries. Ms. Santos, you need to understand the forces you're dealing with, he said, his professional mask finally slipping, to reveal the desperation of a man whose criminal enterprise was being destroyed by public exposure. Titan has resources and connections that extend far beyond what you can imagine. Your temporary legal victories won't protect you from consequences that we can arrange through channels you'll never see coming. The threat was explicit and delivered. In front of cameras that were broadcasting to national audiences, representing exactly the kind of mistake that Maria had been hoping Titan would make under pressure. Mr. Blackwood, are you threatening violence against Ms. Santos and her family on live television? Sarah Chen asked, positioning her camera to capture. Blackwood's response to a question that would either expose him further or force him to retreat. The realization that his threat had been broadcast nationally seemed to finally penetrate Blackwood's desperation, and he appeared to understand that his situation had become irretrievable. But it was Diego who provided the moment that would define the entire confrontation and symbolize the victory of ordinary families over institutional corruption. The 8-year-old emerged from the cabin where he'd been monitoring the situation, walked directly to where Blackwood stood surrounded by federal agents and camera crews, and addressed him with the fearless directness that children could bring to adult situations. "My mom says you're the bad men who hurt people to steal their treasure," Diego said, his clear voice carrying to the cameras and microphones that were documenting every moment of the confrontation. "But we told everyone about what you did, so you can't hurt us anymore." The simple statement, delivered by a child who trusted that truth and publicity were sufficient protection against even the most powerful enemies, crystallized everything that Maria's battle had represented: the struggle between individual rights and institutional power, between honest work and systematic theft, between family values and corporate greed, was reduced to its essential elements by an 8-year-old who understood that sharing the truth was the most powerful weapon available to ordinary people facing extraordinary threats. Blackwood stared at Diego for a long moment, apparently recognizing that his century-old criminal enterprise had been defeated by a single mother and her son who'd refused to be intimidated into silence. "This isn't over," he said quietly, though his words lacked conviction. "Actually, it is," Patricia Winters replied, presenting him with additional court documents. "Jonathan Blackwood, you're being served with a federal indictment for conspiracy, racketeering, and accessory to murder in connection with Titan Resource Development's criminal activities. You have the right to remain silent." The arrest of Titan's chief executive, conducted on live television while he was attempting to illegally seize property from a single mother, provided the perfect conclusion to a story that had captured national attention and exposed systematic corruption that had operated in darkness for nearly a century. As federal agents led Blackwood away in handcuffs, Maria and Diego stood together on the porch of their cabin, surrounded by the journalists, attorneys, and law enforcement officials who had gathered to witness the final confrontation between a family defending their home and the corporate forces that had killed to control valuable resources for generations. The battle for the Silverbrook mining claim was finally over, but its resolution represented something much larger than a simple property dispute. Maria's victory had exposed and destroyed a system of suppression that had prevented countless families from benefiting from valuable discoveries on their own land, while establishing legal precedents that would protect future property owners from similar tactics. In the months that followed, as congressional investigations revealed the full scope of Titan's criminal activities and federal prosecutors obtained convictions against dozens of corporate officials and corrupt government employees, Maria and Diego began the work of developing their property's resources in partnership with ethical mining companies that operated under proper oversight and environmental protection. The underground complex that Augustus Brennan had prepared became the foundation for a mining operation that would eventually yield over $50 million in gold while providing employment for hundreds of workers and contributing millions in taxes to local and state governments. The Silverbrook mining claim became a model for how valuable natural resources could be developed responsibly by the families who discovered them, rather than being seized by corporate interests operating through fraud and violence. But more importantly, Maria's victory had demonstrated that ordinary families could successfully challenge even the most powerful institutional corruption when they refused to be intimidated into silence and used the tools of democracy, legal justice, and public accountability to protect their rights. Diego grew up understanding that his family's treasure had been worth fighting for, not just because of its financial value, but because their battle had protected the rights of countless other families who might face similar challenges in the future. The 8-year-old Hood confronted corporate criminals on live television, became a young man who understood that courage, truth, and family unity were more valuable than any amount of gold. And Maria Santos, the struggling single mother who'd made a desperate $500 gamble to escape eviction, became a symbol of how individual determination could overcome institutional power when combined with strategic thinking, legal expertise, and the courage to expose truth in the face of overwhelming opposition. The cabin that had sheltered Augustus Brennan's secrets for nearly a century became a permanent home for the family that had finally brought those secrets to light. While the underground complex that had preserved evidence of corporate crime, it became a museum that educated visitors about the importance of protecting individual property rights against systematic suppression. The story of the struggling single mother who bought a $500 abandoned cabin and found a secret tunnel to a gold mine had become the story of how one family's courage had exposed and destroyed a century of corporate crime while establishing protections that would benefit countless other families for generations to come. Standing together in the underground chamber where their journey had begun, surrounded by the geological samples and mining equipment that represented both Augustus Brennan's legacy and their own family's future, Maria and Diego Santos understood that they had found something much more valuable than gold beneath their Montana property. They had discovered the power of truth, the strength of family, the unshakable conviction that ordinary people could achieve extraordinary things. When they refused to surrender to forces that seemed too powerful to challenge, the treasure hunt was complete, the battle was won, and their future was secure. But most importantly, they had honored the legacy of everyone who had fought to protect valuable discoveries from corporate theft, while ensuring that the next family to make such a discovery would have legal protections and precedents that would prevent them from facing the same deadly opposition. Maria Santos had transformed from a victim of economic circumstances into a guardian of justice, while Diego had learned that even the most powerful enemies could be defeated by families willing to stand together and fight for what was right. The struggling single mother's $500 gamble had indeed paid off beyond anything she could have imagined, but not just in gold and justice, in security, in legacy, and in the knowledge that sometimes the most important treasures are the ones we create by refusing to let powerful interests destroy the dreams of ordinary families. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. Don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.